It's Game Boy World, and this is the year 1990. Released in January of 1990, Wizards & Warriors X Fortress of Fear helped usher in the new decade with, well, not exactly style, but at least with something like a legacy. Fortress of Fear was of course the sequel to 1989's Iron Sword Wizards & Warriors 2. On that NES game's packaging, the part of protagonist Kouros had been played by romance cover icon Fabio, shortly before he inexplicably transcended into an international celebrity. However, while Fabio was ostensibly the player's avatar in Iron Sword, it was Fortress of Fear that made players truly feel like Fabio. Specifically, it made them feel like Fabio that one time a bird smacked into him in the face while riding a roller coaster. Yes, Wizards & Warriors X, or is that Wizards & Warriors 10, is the video game equivalent of being smashed in the face with a bird at high velocities. It is not a good game. In fact, it's arguably the worst we've seen to date on Game Boy. There have been some rough entries so far to be sure. Hyper Load Runner had no learning curve, Castlevania the Adventure utterly failed to live up to its legacy, and poor Shogi, it involved such complex AI maneuvers that it nearly broke the Game Boy. But none of those games were legitimately bad. All of them offered some sort of redeeming factor. Even the lackluster and badly dated baseball was decently entertaining as a two-player affair. Fortress of Fear, however, offers nothing of value. Its graphics are probably its strongest point, and even those aren't particularly great. Plus, they compromise the gameplay. The gulf in quality between Fortress of Fear and its NES predecessors is as vast as the difference in quality between Castlevania the Adventure and its own NES forebears. The problem is that Wizards & Warriors was a much lower point to fall from. Castlevania was one of the best games on NES, so a disappointing spin-off was still pretty decent. Wizards & Warriors, on the other hand, was solid B material. A drop from there makes for a barely passing grade, if that. Fortress of Fear's baggage comes in several forms, but perhaps worst of all is that it abandons most of what made the NES games remarkable. Wizards & Warriors on NES centered heavily around Kouros' mobility, his ability to leap and bound around the screen. The NES game featured large, multi-tiered stage designs with an almost vertiginous sense of verticality in places. Fortress of Fear, on the other hand, plays out as a very straightforward left-to-right side-scroller. Variety, or what passes for it, comes in the occasional chance to switch directions and scroll right to left. There's very little verticality to speak of, and Kouros will actually take damage if he falls from too far. This is all especially infuriating in light of the fact that Kouros' world seems so cramped here. Fortress of Fear represents a lot of Game Boy firsts, and one of them is that it's the first Game Boy title we've ever seen to suffer from what I'm going to call disproportionate NES envy. At 160 by 144 pixels, the Game Boy offered a much smaller screen resolution than the NES's 256 by 224. NES-style experiences simply couldn't translate to the Game Boy without some sort of compromise. In the case of Super Mario Land and Castlevania the Adventure, designers chose to compromise visual flash. Those games compressed their heroes to smaller sizes than NES fans were used to, resulting in less impressive-looking games. But, by sacrificing graphical sizzle, those games managed to maintain playability on the smaller screen. The tinier heroes felt proportionate to the screen. Castlevania had other issues to be sure, but it didn't feel cramped. The system's other NES-inspired action games to date have all made the same creative compromise as well. Hyper Load Runner, the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle, and so forth. With Fortress of Fear, though, Rare refused to compromise on graphical quality. Kouros looked like a dead ringer for his NES incarnation. Heck, his NES sprite wore silver armor, which is to say gray armor, so the lack of color on Game Boy didn't even really seem like much of a change for him. But in maintaining his NES proportions, Kouros necessarily forced the world around him to become smaller by comparison. There were fewer pixels to either side of Kouros on the screen than on NES, resulting in a more constrictive atmosphere, less visual information, less time to react to obstacles and hazards. This issue would affect many Game Boy titles in the coming years, including Metroid 2 and the Mega Man ports, and Wizards & Warriors really lays out the failings and hazards of the problem right here. The game's level design doesn't really take into account the challenges imposed by the player's poor line of sight. Most monsters and traps appear on screen with too little notice to allow for players to react. Or maybe the designers did take Kouros' huge size into account and deliberately set out to exploit that fact to make Fortress of Fear unreasonably difficult. That actually seems the more likely case given the sheer number of unfair death traps scattered throughout the levels. Wizards & Warriors X defines cheap design. Its stages consist of inconveniently placed monsters that take entirely too many hits to kill. Everything moves at a rapid clip, and deadly projectiles constantly fly in from off-screen without warning. It's the projectiles that make me suspect this whole thing is deliberate. They're scrupulously placed in the worst possible locations, usually around jumps or in conjunction with enemies, and they consistently seem designed to force players to take an untelegraphed hit after committing to some other action. These outrageous slings and arrows demand players memorize each and every stage layout, a need that becomes especially pressing in light of the fact that Fortress of Fear offers no continues. You have 3 lives and whatever extras you can scrounge along the way, and that's it. Now, the Wizards and Warriors series was never particularly about great or fair level design. The first NES game tended to feature unfair odds and slippery platforming. But it worked because Wizards and Warriors for NES was also quite forgiving. It offered infinite continues. And also, it worked because it incorporated a moderate attempt at creating greater depth of play. Horos could collect permanent and semi-permanent power-ups as he advanced, eventually commanding quite an arsenal by the end of his quest. Here, the shorter and more linear nature of the quest moots that. While you can find a few helpful items, namely the jump boots, which are essential for clearing certain gaps, they're temporary, and their presence feels perfunctory at best. The closest Fortress of Fear offers to depth is the fact that you can sometimes jump over walls to find hidden rooms, or stand in certain locations to prompt timed platforms to rise from the depths and create a new path for you. But combined with the awkward controls, cramped screen proportions, and cheap memorization-driven level design, it hardly feels worth the trouble. Fortress of Fear represents a number of firsts for Game Boy, few of them particularly good, which is a shame because it also counts as a more notable first. It was the first Game Boy title to have been developed, published, and released strictly in the West. Now, every Game Boy title to this point was produced in Japan and released there first as well, sometimes exclusively. But Wizards and Warriors was of course created by British studio Rare and bankrolled by American publisher Acclaim. It was not only the first Game Boy title to hail from the West, but also the first not to see a Japanese version, and understandably so. It just wasn't good enough to translate. Being a Rare game, the exact details and circumstances behind Fortress of Fear's creation remain shrouded in mystery. So far as I can tell, Rare has never spoken about the design of the game, credited the creative staff, or even answered whether it's supposed to be called Wizards and Warriors X or Wizards and Warriors 10. So why did the first ever Western-developed Game Boy title turn out to be so lackluster? All we can do is speculate, but my guess personally would be that it was created on a short timeline. Nintendo has always put the Japanese market ahead of others. It's not hard to believe that Western developers didn't even get a hold of development kits for Game Boy until long after their Japanese counterparts. Given that Rare has always excelled at rapid iteration, it seems entirely likely that they got a start on Fortress of Fear long after the likes of Konami and Tosei were already hip-deep in Game Boy development, and simply banged out this project on a short timeline. As a developer, Rare had worked in 2 modes throughout the 80s. There were the high-quality, cutting-edge passion projects like Battletoads and Cobra Triangle. Then there were the quick license works, for apathetic publishers who just wanted a quick buck. And we all know where Acclaim fell on the publisher spectrum. The wicked unfairness and gotcha design of Wizards and Warriors X feels as though Rare, faced with the prospect of returning to an underpowered machine with poor graphical capabilities, reverted to the tricks of their Spectrum days. The absolute lack of balancing or mercy here definitely feels like a throwback to the days of 8-bit microcomputing, where players were expected to struggle mightily for months on end in order to master a game. And that doesn't fly these days though, and the frightful difficulty level of Fortress of Fear comes off as nothing so much as an attempt to pad a small and limited game. There's just not much substance to Rare's portable debut, nor many reasons to recommend it in this day and age. And so, Game Boy's first game to be developed outside Japan, its first game of the 1990s, proved to be lackluster and generally not much fun. Unfortunately, this was not so much a matter of Western developers coming to grips with the system as it was a taste of things to come. And not just for Rare, or Acclaim, or Western developers in general. With the arrival of 1990, the Game Boy Gold Rush was on in earnest, and as we'll soon see, the relatively high quality of 1989's games will soon be but a sweet memory. For more on Game Boy's steady spiral down the drain of quality, keep reading GameBoyWorld.com.